Churchill,
Yes.
who I see asset managers.
Well, we are Pan-African asset managers, primarily domiciled in Mauritius, but looking at opportunities in the African continent, majorly across, be it West Africa, South Africa, East Africa. So I'm the economist now looking at the East African opportunities. That's Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania. So that's pretty much what I do.
Okay.
Who are asset managers? What do you do?
As asset managers, basically we manage, we are, how can I put it? Asset owners are people like pension funds. Pension funds, you put monies with them at least for your retirement. But then we have fund managers, now asset managers, who manages those assets on behalf of the pension funds. So principally, they are given like a mandate to invest on behalf of the asset owners. So that's what asset managers do.
So you don't manage farms, cattle.
No.
Those are also assets.
Just financial assets. Financial assets, yeah.
Okay. We needed just to plug that in so that we understand. When you say asset manager, I see asset manager, that's where you work. It's important for people to know what that is.
Okay.
So we're here because we want to talk about the Kenya debt crisis, unpacking the risks. We've been having this conversation, for a long time. Even last week on Friday, we had a similar conversation about our debt situation in the country. Against a GDP of 11 trillion, we have a debt of
8 trillion as of September.
As per the officially known.
Yes.
Officially
disclosed.
8 trillion shillings in debt.
Could be up to 10, 11 trillion.
Okay. And we've also been told, no government will develop without borrowing. And we've also been told by government is don't look so much at the amount of debt. Look at the capacity to pay. Are we able to pay? Are we able to meet our obligations as when they mature? Are we paying? If we're paying, then it shows that we're okay. What do you say to that?
Well, it's quite a loaded question. And looking at where we are currently, public debt as of September was 8 trillion shillings. And looking at the current financial year, in terms of the debt service, we are looking at 1.16 trillion against the revenue. This is tax revenue and the non-tax revenue. That's another 1.6 trillion. So look at that percentage. Is like for every 100 shillings that we collect in taxes, we pay like close to 67% in terms of servicing our debts, both the interest component of that and also those debts that come to that mature. So that's quite a scary number. But if you compare with some other countries across the continent, you find that we are more or less we're not that bad. Nigeria, its debt service as a percentage to revenue is around 76%. As Kenya, we are around 68%. Ghana, slightly lower at 59%. So from that perspective, from how do we are able to service the revenues, how are you able to service the debt, we are still at an elevated level, which is quite scary, because if you look at even the next financial year, we are still more or less at an elevated level. So that's the crux of the conversation. We have high interest. We have the high public debt, 8 trillion, GDP where it is. But people say that you can't eat GDP. So probably, I know Shiro has brought this issue. Perhaps you may not even look at the public debt ratio as a way of looking at the debt sustainability. Pretty much it's quite in agreement. But the implicit argument underlying how we look at public debt against the GDP is that GDP implicitly implies that this is the income that will come about. If the GDP grows from 11 trillion to say 13 trillion, it means that a component of taxes will also grow in tandem. But because of the structural deficits that we're having in the country, we find that even that portion of tax revenue as a percentage of GDP is not growing in tandem. So we are not able to service the debt that we get ourselves into. So that's now the tragedy of where we are as a country.
Yeah, and our concern, and thanks so much for coming today, and maybe you can help us unpack some of these things. We conducted a report, a study, a review of Kenya's, the fiscal consolidation program, actually, the IMF-sponsored fiscal consolidation program. When I say we, I mean the Okoa Uchumi Coalition. It's a coalition of civil society concerned about debt and concerned about how do we resolve this, concerned about budgeted corruption in debt, and also concerned about the options, because we need to get out of this. And in our assessment, we are in a debt trap. We are borrowing because we are in debt. Now, the government comes up with a debt management strategy paper every year. And this strategy paper seeks to give the options to manage debt prudently within the constitutional requirements. So it needs to be sustainable. It also needs to be minimize risk. And of course, it needs to be accountable and all of that. Kenya, there's been an argument within the political circle about where to borrow, because Kenya must borrow. Of course, we are saying reduce expenditure so that you reduce the need to borrow. So one, reduce expenditure. Yeah. But even if Kenya reduces expenditure, in the immediate, there's a need to borrow. And government had said, we're going to borrow so that we can retire some of the expensive debt, those kind of conversations. And then the question becomes, where do you borrow? Do we borrow domestically, or do we borrow multilaterally, or do we borrow commercially? Multilateral borrowing the basket seems to have reduced because we are now considered a middle income country. Domestic borrowing, the business sector has not been happy with that, because they say when government borrows domestically, it competes with businesses. So government has been going into the commercial markets. Now, our study found that commercial borrowing comes with very many risks, and that countries like India and countries like Argentina are going against that trend, because when you borrow commercially and you're then forced to hold very high currency reserves because you want to cushion the economy because of you're borrowing in foreign currency. So you put yourself in a very risky position. Last week, we were also told by Dr. Ibrahim Rugo that much as commercial debt, Eurobonds and all, appear cheap on the face of it, when you compute the different conditionalities that come with them, they're actually not necessarily cheaper than the domestic debt. So the question is, government is now proposing to increase domestic borrowing at the expense of commercial borrowing. The Parliamentary Budget Office has said no. Before you can do that, you have to fix the domestic market. So the question we are asking is, where should we be borrowing? Government has is getting back into the Eurobond market. Is this good for us? We don't know the terms those contracts come with. There seem to be some interests around the Eurobond. So there are so many factors. And I, it's a very long question trying to set that. But I think if you were the Minister of Finance, or if you were the chair of the Finance Committee, giving advice on the optimal, on where to borrow, whether domestic, whether commercial, and whether there are multilateral options, or whether not to borrow at all, what would you say?
Oh, that's quite a difficult question. Clearly putting me on the spot. But at the crux of it is that there needs to be a balance between borrowing externally and borrowing domestically, and even externally, which kind of borrowing are you getting yourself into? As you put it, borrowing domestically, right now you find that in any given month, Treasury through CBK is the fiscal agent of Treasury, comes to float a bond. In fact, for this month, they had two auctions totaling around 62 billion domestically, and they got massive subscription on those two auctions. And you can see banks are also dominant players in terms of lending to the government. We have also pension funds. We also have retail clients. Me and you can also lend to the government. And the kind of interest rates that you see domestically, double digits. There was a paper that was there's one of the bonds that was in one of those auctions, which is maturing in 20 years' time. So you find that the interest on that paper is 13%. So for every 100 shillings you invest, you get a return of 13 shillings from the government every year, it's quite a decent money if you compare from a safe investments perspective.
Yeah.
So those are the dynamics. Even for banks, they tend to see, okay, lending to the government is quite, it's
Lucrative.
a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer as opposed to lending to, say, city over here and perhaps ask him to pay 20%, but now the risk is quite there. So they tend to lend to the government because of the risk profile of the government is quite low to any other person who comes to borrow from the banks. So that's what crowding out effect means, that because the government or the banks are now lending to the government, they don't have monies now to lend to the
lend to
private
the-
sector. So if you get to the to the external side, majorly on the commercial borrowing, Eurobonds, which is now a commercial borrowing, even as banks or as government borrows domestically, it's on commercial terms. As it also borrows through Eurobonds, is also on commercial terms. But now the thing here is the last Eurobond that we got, it was 6.3%. That's maturing in 2034. So for the next 11 or 10 years or 13 or 12 years, the government will be paying, for every 100 shillings, will be paying 6 shillings and 30 cents on that bond. But now the question is, because this bond is in dollar terms. So at the onset, if it was borrowing like for like, assuming there's no exchange rate risk, if it borrows 100 shillings equivalent, it will be paying 6 shillings and 30 cents. But if exchange rates, so the shilling depreciates, right now it's at 114, it goes to 120 shillings. So it means that even that 6 shillings and 30 cents that you are supposed to pay in equivalent terms, it could even go to 8 shillings or whatever. And that's what you are seeing with the Eurobond that was floated in 2014. Then it's maturing in next 2024. So the interest rate on that was 6.25%. So for every 100 shillings, you'll pay 6 shillings and 25 cents. But now the currency, then in 2014, the dollar to the shilling was 87 shillings. Now it's gone to 114. So there's like a 20% increase in what we pay. So the risk in commercial or the Eurobonds is now on the exchange rate risks because of, it can't just be static
Sure.
at where it is. Yeah.
I want to ask you this question. Huh?
Yeah.
Must we borrow from the euro bond? Must
we borrow
we?
commercially abroad?
Actually, the reason I'm asking is this. The discussion is around us being a middle-income country.
Yeah.
So, are there avenues where a middle-income country can actually borrow at rates that
Cheaply.
Thank you, Eric.
Yes. So the issue here is that when we became a middle-income country, you find that even Kenya predominantly used to borrow from the world banks. Now on concessional terms, you find that they could get at rates of 2%, but now it's spreading, going all the way to 50 years. Concessional terms means that, say, they're given a grace period of, say, 10 years or 15 years, and then they start repaying from year 11 or year 16. They're about all the way to year 50. That's when the loan matures. But now with Eurobonds, it's quite... and then with those kind of multilateral loans, you identify a specific project. Say there's a particular road here, there's a bridge there, there's a hospital there, and then the World Bank comes and finance those particular projects. So those are project loans. But now when it comes to Eurobonds, it's like a blank check. You're given, okay, you want 100 billion shillings. Okay, fine. It will be raised in the international exchanges. You'll be given, and then whatever you do with it, that's upon you. Us as people who lend you the money will just want the return. So
for middle-income countries, there are no blank checks.
There is, but now the risk for the people who are perceived as low-income countries, for them even to get access to what is called the international markets, now the Eurobonds, you find it's a bit difficult because probably their credit rating is quite lower than a middle-income country. So at the onset, they may not even get access to Eurobonds. Some countries in Africa, such as Rwanda, Burundi, for instance, Somalia, South Sudan, they may not even borrow from the Eurobonds because of the fact that their risk rating is perceived to be lower than a country like Kenya or the middle income country.
Last question. How did we become middle income? I mean, and since we're middle income, how are we supposed to understand this elevated status that we have locally? How does the Mwananchi feel that he belongs to this middle income club?
Well, it occurred in 2014. That's when we had the previous rebasing of the economy. Basically, rebasing is whereby if the base year that the statistics they look at is now brought to a much more recent year. So that rebasing was from, I think, year 2000 all the way to 2009. And what was the effect of this rebasing is that what previously had been reported as the GDP of the year 2013, it was now revised to be 25% higher. So it now made...
Who revised it?
The Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, as they now factor in some other facets of the economy that hadn't been factored in when they were doing the initial statistics. Things like, say, between 2000 and 2009, we had some things like infrastructure, we had things like mobile telephony, which weren't there. And so now to reflect those factors, they had to rebase it to a year which now had all these factors. So that's the effect of rebasing, and it led to our economy now being 25% higher. And now when they do, like, then we are a country population of, say, 40 million. They look at whatever GDP it was, they divide it by 40 million, and then they come to these thresholds that if the income is like 110,000 shillings, that's the threshold for it to transition from a low income country to a middle income country. So those are the statistics that were done.
Sure. So even if you look at these risks, I mean, some of the risks that we're talking about in monetary, we're talking about, currency, and saying that, look, there's a possibility that as currencies depreciate or appreciate, then the country could essentially be paying more on the 100 shillings for the next 10 or 11 years. But then I see secondary risks here. And so what risks, for those who are watching all of this play out, what risks are there to the people of this country now that, as we are looking at, you're paying 6 shillings on every 100 shillings, you could pay 8. So this 100 shillings that would be used for 1, 2, 3, then clearly there's a reduction of what then could be applied in terms of development in the country, and then the buffering of the economy. So what risks do you see that are there that you and I, people who are doing their daily bread activities, would understand that it puts us in a more precarious situation?
Absolutely. And it goes down to the point that I raised earlier, like in this current budget, the kinds of revenue we are raising 1.6 trillion, and then the debt service, that's basically repayment of the interests and also those debts that mature, is around 1.6 trillion. So if you work for it, for every 100 shillings that we have as revenue, 68% of that goes towards payment of all these debts that we have incurred, be it interest and also the principal. So that means that 32 shillings is what we are remaining to play with, be it payment of salaries, be it development. So we just find ourselves running amok with still continuing to borrow more, at least to plug that deficit. So that's the risk that we are seeing. So we'll still be in this debt treadmill because we still have to borrow more to plug the deficit. And a good example of that is going to the division of revenue bill. Right now, we are still in the middle of this budget cycle. The budget policy statement, medium-term debt management strategy is in the floor of Parliament. It's up for debate. And after that, we get into the division of revenue bill, which basically is now to split the revenue that will be raised nationally between the national government and also the county government. So you find that what I saw when I analyzed the last division of revenue bill last year, it was around 1.6 trillion. It has to be equally divided. 370, is it to 370 billion going to counties, and then the other balances to be split to the national government. But if you have a significant chunk of that going to service the debt, you find that even the governments, there are some critical expenditure under Article 201 of our Constitution that has to be funded out of this revenue that we collect. But that, even from that analysis, we are in a deficit position. So already we are lying precariously.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Churchill. You're telling us that there are exchange rate risks with the Eurobond, with this external borrowing. And my question is, and for government to protect itself, it then pegs the exchange rate. Maybe you can tell us how that dynamic is working, because our study found that by pegging the exchange rate, there are other impacts on the country. Then with the domestic borrowing, you're telling us that this crowds out the private sector. How come countries like Japan has like, I'm looking here, 250% debt to GDP ratio. Majority of that is in domestic currency. How come these countries are able to borrow so expensively, so high domestically in their own currency, which means you have much more control, you're able to do your investment? How do we get there? And is it therefore, is there a need for us to change is there something wrong in our domestic market?
Thanks for that. For the specific case of Japan, what has happened is now their central bank, Bank of Japan, has accumulated 50% of the local debt. So for instance, if, I don't know the specifics, but if, for instance, their debt is at around 1 trillion, whatever Japanese yen, so you find that a half of that is held by the Central Bank of Kenya, but Central Bank of Japan, but that's not the case locally. Here, our central bank does not hold any of the debt. That's called monetizing of the deficit.
What does holding the debt mean?
By buying the debt, like it issues, but then their treasury issues the debt, but then the Bank of Japan now comes and buy a portion of that debt. So it's quite tricky because it's a way of stimulating the economies. But if you get into Japan, the economy is still, I think it's been growing less than 2% in any given year. Kenya's economy, the worst to 2020, it grew, it shrunk by 0.3%. Last year, it's estimated it grew by around 7% or thereabout. So it's a bit, it's growing at a faster pace than Japan. So with that kind of support by the Bank of Japan, they're able to hold massive debt in terms of their GDP, close to 250%. So that's the difference that you are seeing in the Kenyan market vis-a-vis now the Japanese market. The other thing that you mentioned around the external debt issue, like what can the government do? Can it be able to peg its currency? That will be a bit, it will be a bit a tricky balancing affair. For instance, here we're looking at most of the debt, speaking of Eurobonds, is in dollar denomination. So that means that if we peg our Kenya shillings to the dollar, say at 100, for every $1, it's at 100 shillings. So it means that we might even mimic what the Fed, the US economy, is doing. But these are two different economies. Its growth rate is, say, 4% in any given year. Ours is 2%. It's actually around 2%. It came to 4% last year because of the base effect, comparing 2021 vis-a-vis 2020. So that's why it went a bit higher. But having said that, you find that our economy is growing quite fast than what the US economy is. It means that even if the US might, for one reason or another, might want to lower its interest rate, at least to support the economy, even Kenyan Central Bank will have to mirror what the US is doing. So at least to maintain that exchange rate to be at 100, for every $1, it's at 100 shillings. So that's also the other negative, or the downside risk of pegging our currencies to, say, the dollar or what the US is doing, which might not be counterproductive.
So, I mean, I think, and there's a question that has come in here, and I think just kind of linked into what I wanted to ask, because the question on the minds of many people is that, all right, so all this borrowing that is happening, because we're talking about being in a debt crisis, all this borrowing that is happening, are we saying unequivocally that the majority of it is going towards servicing other debts? Or are we saying that there are significant tangible things that we can see? 100 billion borrowed from X has gone directly into this and we can actually see it playing out. Or is the country borrowing and it's going to pay? Is that what we are saying? Or can we see things that have been borrowed, that the money has been borrowed for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what's on paper, according to the PFM Act, is that whatever we borrow has to go towards capital expenditure. That's the development programs, perhaps doing building roads or doing development activities which will now enhance either the human capital of the people around, or it will also such that they can be able to build efficiencies as an economy. So that's what's on paper according to the PFM Act. But what we are seeing playing out is a pivot from what's actually that. We've had stories whereby even the Auditor General pinpointing that some of the debt that has come in has ended up in recurrent expenditure. For instance, when you come to local markets, we usually hear infrastructure bonds. Once in a while, the central bank, on behalf of the Treasury, issues infrastructure bonds. So these infrastructure bonds, ideally, they're supposed to go to specific projects, be it in roads, water. It used to be quite specific. But then you could find that month that, say, infrastructure bond is issued, say, 100 billion, you find that same month there's a maturity close to 30 billion, which has to be first to be paid from this 100 billion you've received. So clearly that's telling us that a portion of what we call, say, infrastructure bonds or some of this debt that we incur is going towards recurrent expenditure, not even the development expenditure. So if you could get some visibility onto some of the what the commercial borrowing is getting into, at least with the bilateral loans, at least with the multilateral loans, you can more or less pinpoint that it's going to some projects.
And would that be okay? I mean, looking at it from a financial economic perspective, if there was all this money that was being borrowed and we can actually see what it's doing, even if we're paying it back and majority of what we get is going towards debt, but we can see the results of what money was borrowed for, would that be okay? And maybe okay is a bit of a rudimentary word to use, but would it be satisfactory?
It will be satisfactory.
If that was the case.
If that's the case. And if I may bring it down to the level of a common monarchy, I mean, you may earn your salary, that's what we could call the ordinary revenue to the government. And then perhaps you might want to increase your business, you might want to stock up your business, and then you go to a bank and then get a loan so that you can be able to expand your business and then can get some returns out of that. So if you can, that's what happens in individual basis. So if you can now extrapolate it to the national level, that, okay, whatever monies that the government is borrowing, and it can be able to enhance the quality of lives of people through the various developmental projects that in the long run might be able to increase either the efficiency of a country or even increase our economic development, that we can feel, everyone can feel in a tangible way that, okay, 5 years ago, perhaps there wasn't a road, but because of the roads, we've been seeing some inflows of businesses. That's something that we can say that, okay, we can be able to borrow, but so that we can, it's a way of fast-tracking our development. But if you're borrowing, but it's getting towards offsetting some of the legacy issues, so that's where the rain starts to beat us.
Right.
So the problem is lack of transparency with regard to where the money is going, and we are also not assured about the viability or the returns of those projects. If we were to assume transparency and viability of projects, where would you advise government of Kenya to borrow, in the coming months? Would you, or even in the coming year, under this debt strategy, would you be saying go for more of the Eurobond? Blank check, of course, is risky because of the lack of transparency. Would you be saying it's better for Kenya to be borrowing externally, domestically, or what kind of balance? Because I think they were saying maybe something like 70% or 68% will be domestic, and the rest will be external. Do you think that can be supported?
Well, great question. And I didn't even mention this, but one of the budget books, there are various budget books that are usually presented around the budget. So there's one called Program-Based Budget. So if you get into the pages of that particular document, you find that one of the things that Treasury has put out explicitly is that the rate of return on their investments is around 10%. That's the target rate of return on the investments, which means that if they borrow or if they invest, say, 100 billion, they expect that every year they could even be able to get 10% of that investment in one way or another. But jury is still out if you get into the various kind of public investments that the government has gotten ourselves. Are you sure that you're getting that 10% return? The answer is,
SGR is losing 200, is it 200B?
Yeah.
Yeah.
24 billion.
200 million?
200 million, say, per
Per
month, and then
month.
per year is coming to around, it's quite a big number.
Losing.
Churchill,
Yeah.
I've listened to you.
Losing, yeah.
And from an economic perspective, I see what you're saying with great clarity. Now, there's an unfortunate situation, however, which is our reality. Economists such as yourself understand, know, financial people know, understand. But it is not the economists of financial people who actually implement these things. It's our politicians who implement it. So at the end of the day, I even feel it's unfair to ask you how the Mwananchi will actually benefit. Because when we talk about Kenya being a middle-income country, and yet the story, even before COVID, our poverty levels were not going down, and we're a middle-income country. The issue that bedevil us, which were brought to the fore with greater clarity with COVID, were still there, and we're a middle-income country. So for me, I'm thinking, before we became a middle-income country, we had these problems. We're now a middle-income country, we have these problems. So
we have roads, we have
had roads before.
we have telephone,
We had telephones before.
greater access to electricity.
Are they worth 11 trillion? That's what we borrowed.
No, we've not borrowed 11 yet.
Well,
Actually, Wanjiru has,
That's the estimate.
Wanjiru has a valid point
Yeah.
here,
It's about
because
Well,
given
it's
the lack
eight-
of
It's 8 trillion.
Eric, given the lack of
on the
transparency that
The
we have in
thing is,
this,
on they after rebasing the economy,
Yes.
just like Churchill explained. So, if we rebase the economy based on now the current status of the country, so you have greater infrastructure development, you have a more expansion of infrastructure, roads, electricity, connectivity, telephony, internet, and all, and that is what caused us to elevate. It may not necessarily mean that people would then now stop.
being poor, they are supposed to.
well, they're supposed to be better off.
All these things that we
Supposed to
talk
be better off.
about,
If they're those returns,
the
10% returns.
the end result has to be human. Roads on their own, of what use are they if human beings aren't using them? Electricity, if we aren't utilizing that particular resource, of what use is it? So if all this discussion, everything we're saying, beautiful as it sounds, and in my mind, the common denominator, the measure for all these things is what we call the Mwananchi, and his situation just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, then my question, what are we a middle-income country for?
And then also, Churchill, you haven't answered the question, where should we be borrowing? Or are you saying we shouldn't be borrowing? What's the mix?
Okay, let me get to your question first before you get to cities. The mix, as stated in that medium-term debt management strategy, which is more or less what has been playing out over the last couple of years, you find that a huge chunk of it is borrowed, is domestic borrowing, and even what is expected to play out in the next financial year as per this 2022 medium-term debt management strategy, whereby the split to domestic is 68% against 32%. Still, a huge chunk of it is now getting into domestic borrowing. It's quite the risk for domestic borrowing is now that high interest payments that we pay, double digits on any amount that we borrow. So that's the risk. For external...
What sets those interest rates?
It's in the market. Like right now, for instance, if what I mentioned that when the government comes to float a bond on a monthly basis, that bond you can be able also to buy or sell it at the secondary market. That's where the Nairobi Securities Exchange comes in. The same way you can buy shares through the IPO route, you can also be able to buy or sell, trade at
Yes,
the
but
NSE.
what determines the exchange rate, and how are countries, able to keep the exchange rate low to spur the borrowing?
There are different facets to that that play out, but from let me walk you through the current account basis. From that current account, Kenya is a net importer nation. Most of the imports that we import are what are called intermediate goods, whereby you borrow some components, you import some of the components, and then they become part of your production, part of your raw materials as you produce your goods. So a huge chunk of our imports are intermediate goods. Some are capital goods and some are for consumption. So there's no way we can run away from that. We haven't perhaps developed our industries to the extent that we can be able not to rely on external market to get into imports. So we find that from a current account deficit, that the difference between what we export to the other economies and what we import from them is around 1.2 trillion. There are some other offsetting effects like diaspora remittance, which grew like 20% over the course of last year to around 370 billion. So it offsets it, so it comes to what is called the current account, comes to a deficit of around 640 billion. So how do we finance this? Because we are in need of exchange, at least for the imports. That's where you find that the government on the other side can either get into capital financing of that current account, or even through capital investment. That's where this whole mix of external borrowing comes in, because they have to finance this deficit one way or another. If you get monies through Eurobond or through IMF, it's a way of offsetting this difference. So it comes to the reserves and it more or less stabilizes. So that's we can't run away from external borrowing if we are a net importer country. That's the truth. We can't run away from.
So we must stimulate our exports.
Yes, we can. We need to
get out of
stimulate
this debt crisis
in a way.
And also use what we are borrowing
properly
for its intended purpose. Because that's like you said, if you look at the 8 trillion shillings that we've borrowed, let's say how much has been borrowed in the last 9 years? Of that 8 trillion. So let's say 6 trillion shillings borrowed in the last 9 years.
Yeah.
And the kind of projects that this money has gone into, if we were prudent in actually ensuring that this money comes and it goes into a proper project, it goes into a proper project that is spurring economic growth, would be able to say, okay, yeah, we're borrowing, but also we are growing, we are developing, we are growing our industries, our value addition in agriculture is improving. The problem is that we are borrowing and we don't know where it's going, or we are finding clever ways of that money getting misappropriated. So it's better fiscal management of the entire economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can't entirely blame, say, the Jubilee government, where we are, like that 6 trillion increase in public debt. Remember, when the time this administration was coming into power, we were transitioning from what was then the local governments and getting into county governments. Yeah. And if you look at the budget that was there for the Ministry of Local Government, it was around 12 billion or something lower than that. Now it's ballooned to around 270 billion. And then there are some other these huge infrastructure or investments that each and every subsequent administration wants to prove themselves on.
Churchill, can I challenge you? Because what you're saying is that devolution is the driver of. You've said you can't blame the Jubilee.
It's part of
it. But we were still delivering services. 27% of all national revenue was going to local authorities. Yes.
No.
It was. If you look at the various disbursements and the districts, the various disbursements from national to county, when computed, because there was a PER done, was up to 27% of the national revenue going to the local level. Now, counties came in, yes, but they also assumed functions that had been done by the national. So when you say you don't blame the Jubilee government, then there is something you're missing in this narrative. Namely, did the Jubilee government transfer the functions? Did it transfer the personnel? Then secondly, is the 300B, of that goes to the county government, the causal factor? Or is it the amounts that are going in these infrastructure grants? Or is it the fact that the national government wage bill has been increasing? Even though the functions went down, the Jubilee government continues to create new state-owned enterprises, continues to hire. And then there is a problem we have that was pointed out last time. They are creating employment at a cost. If you recall what Dr. Rugo said, unfortunately, the pensions of government officers, the way it's structured, is a time bomb. And that one is compounding. So that even the wage bill is being pushed even further because of the pension. So to me, I don't agree that we can't blame the Jubilee government. They didn't downsize national government. They then borrowed irresponsibly, expensively, in risky manners, and then invested poorly. And then there's been a lot of corruption. So I think it's many...
There are many facets to it. And I also agree with you. Perhaps I should have said that this pivot from the local governments into county governments perhaps was one of the other factors that led to where we are in, and also compounding to the fact that now we had that middle income status coming in, and then we had this whole issues around Eurobond, and also China. Remember, it got into world arena in 2000. So by the time we started getting traction at around 2020, 2010, thereabouts, with its Belt and Road Initiative, by the time now this government was coming to power, so there were Chinese governments who were dalliance with so many other economies. So all that factors came into play to where we are right now. You find that if you get into the split of the external debt, multilateral, bilateral, that's between Kenya and other countries. I think it's around 28%, but a significant chunk of that is in one lender, that's China. So that's what wasn't
another
there.
factor.
Yeah, that wasn't there before.
Many factors.
Churchill, we thank you very much for joining us. And we want to have you again one of these days to continue this conversation, trying to understand where we are at and what then we can do. Churchill Ogutu is an economist. He works for IC Asset Managers based in Mauritius, but he's in the country. And we've been having this conversation on Kenya debt crisis, unpacking the risks